This is Dan, and this is the Napkin Academy. Today's lesson is the case study to round out our 6x6 review. So we're going to put the entire 6x6 into action today. The problem was a typical business problem that many large organizations face. It was a problem of what to do with our brand. And the solution, as we'll see, becomes visible through the creation of a multivariable plot, which will require us to make our way all the way around the 6x6, starting with a who and what portrait, going on to a how much chart, a conceptual map for where, time through a timeline, and a little bit of how, all coming together into our final multivariable plot. Another name for this case study could be Thomson and the $1 million chart. So here's the story. A few years ago, the Thomson Corporation, big company as we'll see, hired the consulting company I was working for at that time to help Thomson with their brand strategy. Now, you may ask the very same question that I had when the company called Thomson called us, which was, who in the heck is Thomson? I have never heard of this company. So we started to do a little bit of research and learned who Thomson is. It turns out that back at that time, I believe the year was 2001, Thomson was, believe it or not, the world's largest publisher. What I mean by that is Thomson was the publishing company that published Westlaw, the world's largest law book series. Thomson was the company that published the ISI Web of Knowledge, one of the most frequently cited sources of scientific and peer-reviewed information. Thomson was the owner of Wadsworth, again, one of the world's largest publishers of school textbooks, higher education, university-level textbooks. Thomson was the owner, publisher of First Call, the most frequently cited news source in the Wall Street Journal for information about company stocks and trading. Thomson was the company that published the PDR, the Physician's Desk Reference, the most commonly published medical book in the world that sits on the desk of every doctor on earth. So that's who Thomson is. It turns out that we weren't the only ones who didn't know who Thomson was. In fact, the reason that Thomson had called us is because the company, particularly its corporate communications office, the owners of the company's brand, had been concerned because they had begun to suspect that the problem myself and my consulting colleagues has of having heard of individual products but not being aware of the overall brand was a common problem around the globe among customers of Thomson. So what Thomson did is they undertook a 1-year worldwide brand study to try to see if they could understand what were the perceptions of the Thomson brand around the entire globe among 1,500 leading decision makers, important business people, people who subscribed to individual Thomson products, wanted to find out what these people thought about the brand. The study was commissioned, the study was undertaken, the study went on for over a year, and in the end, the summary came back. And this is exactly what it looked like. In fact, this picture, which is a screenshot of, as you can tell, an extraordinary, elaborate, and complicated PowerPoint document, was the resulting executive summary that came back. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is there's a tremendous amount of information contained within this presentation. But the trouble, of course, is trying to figure out what is it that I should look at. Should I look here? Should I look here? Should I look here? There's so much in here, I don't even know where to start. So the problem for the Thomson folks wasn't so much not having the data. They had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces of data of all kinds of interest. The problem was making sense of what did it mean, and then being able to say, I understand it enough to take action and know what I need to do regarding changes that might be necessary to the company brand. So that was really the underlying question that Thomson came to us with. Can you help us read through all of this information that's been collected and help us come up with some simpler way to make sense of it so we can look at it and know what to do? So what we did is we went ahead and started out with the 6x6 model, and we all remember the first slice in our 6x6 is to just try to identify who. Who are the players in this world that we're looking at? And what we were able to identify as we went through all of that data was essentially that there were 7 main competitors, 7 main companies that occupied this world in which Thomson was active. And those companies, some of which we'd heard of. There was Bloomberg, there was a company called McGraw-Hill, very familiar, a company called Pearson, some of us had heard of that, a company called Reuters, everyone had heard of Reuters. Then there was a company called Reed Elsevier, another company, Wolters Kluwer, and then of course there was Thomson. Once we had understood who the companies were, we thought, well, we want to understand a little bit more about what do they look like. And as we looked through the data, we realized that there was an interesting way that you could visually summarize all of these companies. Now, all of these companies, there are a couple of things that we know. They're all publishers, and they're all what we're going to call professional information publishers, which means that they're not just publishing popular books, but they're publishing books that are going to exist largely in the business-to-business space. So one thing we know about what these companies do is they're publishers, and let's just represent that with books and databases of electronic media in the B2B space. So that's what these companies do, kind of a little portrait of what these companies do. But then as we continued to look at them, we realized they had something else in common aside from just what they did, which was how they were structured. And in the end, we decided that we could represent these companies with something we ended up calling the brand pyramid. What we mean by that is if you were to look at any one of these publishing companies, you would find that at the top of their brand, they had a big corporate brand. So, that might have been Bloomberg or Pearson or Thomson, what have you. And then underneath that, each one of them being active in different industries would have what we might call a series of different industry groups, industry divisions. And in some of those cases, those divisions had the same name as the corporate brand, and in some cases they had a different name. Then each one of those industry divisions, if you continued to look, you'd realize we came to see that each one of those industry divisions actually published many, many smaller individual brands and products, and we were going to call those the actual product. And those had names in many cases, as well as the industry divisions having names, as well as the corporation having names. So we thought, well, if we're going to really look into this, we need to be able to understand all 3 levels of how these companies brand themselves. So that takes care of slice number 1, the who and the what. Which brings us, of course, to slice number 2 in the 6x6, which, as remember, is where we start to getting into quantities, number, and the question of how much. So we thought, let's line up all 7 of our cast of characters using our pyramid structure, and let's rank them according to size of revenue. And so as at the first year of our study, we were able to rank all 7 companies, and if we drew in our pyramid, we made each pyramid the size relative to that company's entire annual gross revenue in billions. We'd end up with different sized pyramids, and this is the order in which they would go. And we would see that, what do you know? Thomson, at almost $6 billion, is the largest of all of these companies, with Pearson not far behind, Reed Elsevier also not far behind, and so on, all the way down the list, to relatively puny little Bloomberg at the very bottom in terms of revenue, with half the revenue, $3 billion. So now we've got an interesting mapping of how much. We've actually got 2 things here. We've got who and we've got how much. But let's face it, as we look at this, we get some insights. We get an insight in terms of size, but that's pretty much all we get. We need more to begin to understand how we might want to think about Thomson as from a brand perspective. So then what we said is, remember that each one of these companies works really at 3 levels. There's that corporate level at the top of their pyramid, their industry level, and then their products at the bottom. So we thought, let's break them out by industry. And let's start with Thomson, that seems to be active in many industries. Thomson is active in the financial industry, the learning industry, the legal and regulatory industries, scientific and healthcare, and we thought we'd put another for other just as a holding spot. Because as we looked across all of these companies, we realized that in one way or another, all of them are active in these 4 industries or some subset of those 4 industries. So what we wanted to do is get a little more in-depth understanding of what these companies look like from a how much perspective, by not just saying here's total revenue, but let's look at revenue by industry group. And this is what we were able to find for Thomson. So in the financial services industry, about 1.2 billion came from of its revenue came from financial. About 1.4 billion of revenue came from education. Biggest, interesting, legal and regulatory, about 6.2, and the last, slightly under $1 billion, came from scientific and healthcare. And then we thought, well, let's continue that same model out across all 7 competitors. And here is what we ended up with. Now, the data are starting to give us some visual insight. And again, we're only at slice number 2, the how much. So let's review this for a moment. Thomson, largest company, revenue breakdown across industry like this. Now here's something interesting. Look at Pearson, number 2, but actually the largest in the learning industry. And look at Reuters down here. Reuters, in terms of total revenue, is number 4, but all of its revenue really comes from one source, one industry, the financial industry. So even though Reuters is number 4 overall, it's number 1 in the financial industry. And look down here at little Bloomberg. Bloomberg, very parallel to Reuters, only active in one industry, in financial industry. So in fact, if we were to rank these companies by their financial offerings only, the ranking would shift, wouldn't it? Reuters would be number 1, Bloomberg would be number 2, and Thomson would be number 3. And so it continues. The only industry, in fact, in which Thomson is active, in which Thomson is the largest, is the legal and regulatory industry. That's an insight worth noting. The only industry in which Thomson is number 1 is in legal and regulatory. Isn't that something? We're beginning to see that even though this largest company, it's in many ways the most broken apart in terms of where its revenue comes from. So as we'll remember now, slice number 3 in our 6x6 is the slice that shows us where things are. So we've already collected who, we've already collected how much. Now what we want to do, as we remember, is to create a map. And how do we create a map? We talked about this. Every map starts with some kind of coordinate system, usually north, south, west, and east. But in this case, we want to map out where all of these companies sit. We're not going to use that kind of coordinate system. We need another one. Well, how about if we say for our coordinate system, for the horizontal axis, we actually map out companies from those that operate in one industry to those that operate in multiple industries. Four plus in this case. That becomes then one aspect of our coordinate system. Now we need 2 coordinate systems in order to begin to create some kind of meaningful map. So let's go ahead and add a second coordinate system based on the data that we had been able to collect, which was a measurement of corporate brand recognition, which is a very simple way of saying, back in that global study that Thomson undertook, when someone was asked, have you ever heard of this company? Here's Thomson. Have you ever heard of them? Or any other company. Here's Bloomberg. Here's Reuters. Have you ever heard of them? This is a measure of whether the person said, oh yes, I've heard of them, or whether they said, never heard of them. The higher the company is going to be on the scale, the more likely they were heard of. The lower a company is on the scale, the less likely that they were heard of. So guess what we've now got? We've got a coordinate system indicating where, upon which we can now start to plot the data points of where our different companies sit. Where, conceptually, do our companies sit on this coordinate system? What we did then is we took the first company, and remember, going back to our how much data, we were able to identify that Bloomberg, the smallest of all the companies in the competitive set, ranked very high on brand recognition globally. That is to say, when asked, everybody said, yep, I've heard of Bloomberg. And then we continued, and the next one was Reuters, a bigger company sitting equal height to Bloomberg on customer brand recognition, but you'll notice that Reuters has pushed out a little because Reuters does offer a little bit of some other industries, primarily financial, but a little bit of other industries as well. And then we continued, and the next one was McGraw-Hill. Now McGraw-Hill was interesting because McGraw-Hill makes a lot of money from education. It makes some money from financial services as well, and it makes a fair amount of money from legal and regulatory, just a little bit. So what that means is that McGraw-Hill moves further out on our scale of how many types of industries, how many offerings does it have, and is lower in terms of corporate brand recognition. Fewer people had heard of McGraw-Hill. So I hope that you can see how this kind of map, this is a concept map, how this concept map is coming together. What we're actually doing, of course, is we are beginning to build our multi-variable plot. And that's where we're really starting to stitch things together. So for a quick review, we've got who as one of our dimensions. We've got how much as another dimension. And we've got this kind of coordinate system where as another dimension. So let's continue. When we mapped in all 7 of the companies onto our map, here is what we found. Let's look at this for a moment because now things are becoming insightful. Bloomberg and Reuters, companies that are active in largely one industry, have high brand recognition. McGraw-Hill, that offers a few industries, has mid-level brand recognition. All of the other companies, the corporations that are pretty spread across the number of offerings they have very low brand recognition. And here's Thomson out here, right? Kind of, in this undifferentiated space. Very few people have ever heard of Thomson, and guess what? It's operating in multiple markets. Now at this point in the story, now that we've covered 3 of the slices, who are the companies and what do they look like? How many of them are there and some quantitative measurements about them? And where do they sit in this market space in relation to each other? Let's take a little pause. Because I want to tell you that at this point, we took the consulting company that I was working with, we took this chart and we showed it to the folks at Thomson, to our clients. The reason we did that is we wanted to show them in a clearer way a summary of all of the information that we've been able to glean from those hundreds and hundreds of pages of data. And this is how it had all boiled together. This single multi-variable plot that already contains many dimensions of data in a way that we can see something and be able to get some insight and start to think about what we need to do with this company's brand. As we shared this multivariable plot with our clients in that meeting, a lot of heads started to nod and say, yes, it appears that there's something interesting in here that we've never seen before. The relationship of ourselves to all of these other companies represented in this visual way is quite fascinating because we never really thought of ourselves like that. So what do you think, they asked us, we could do about it? What great insights does this plot show? And as that question was asked, someone appeared in the room. CEO Dick Harrington, the CEO of this entire $6 billion company, Thomson, happened to be walking by the conference room and saw our chart, our multivariable plot, up on the wall in a huge printout. And he came in and he said, "Hey, this looks really interesting. Can you guys walk me through what you're looking at?" And we did, with, of course, a little bit of nerves that we hadn't anticipated because we didn't know that the CEO was likely to walk by with our chart. So we explained what we've seen, the trend that seems to show that companies that operate across multiple industries tend to be less well known from a brand perspective. And he said, well, okay, that's where we are today, but what about tomorrow? Where do we want to be tomorrow? Thus, you'll notice adding in slice number 4, the question of when. And we said, well, we understand that there's a market space for you right here. What would happen, Mr. Harrington, if Thomson broke out of this industry standard and said that Thomson tomorrow doesn't have to be down here, but with effective brand strategy can push that pyramid up and occupy this presently unclaimed space of being the one publisher across multiple industries that has high brand recognition? Wouldn't that be a great thing to do? And Mr. Harrington said, yeah, of course. That would be a great thing to do. That would do a lot of benefit for my company in order to sell and get investors. So we know when we want to do that. Let me give you a date. Can you do that in 3 years? And we said yes. And then he said, okay, so how are you going to do that? Which, as we remember, becomes slice number 5. How? And so we said, well, we have an idea. That if you want to move your pyramid up, the way we need to do that is to fill in this top, the corporate brand recognition side, to make it so that people are familiar with the overall corporate name. And the way we're going to do that is by taking advantage of the brand recognition that already exists at the product level. Every one of these products is exceptionally well known. So what we suggest you do, what we suggest you begin to think about, is a strategic rebranding that says from now on it won't just be Westlaw, but it will be Thomson Westlaw. And it won't be the ISI Web of Knowledge, it will be Thomson ISI, and it will be the Thomson Physician's Desk Reference, and it will be Thomson First Call, and it will be Thomson Wadsworth. And in fact, what we'll be doing is making sure that anybody who's heard of a product, which is everybody, begins to associate that product with the corporate name as well. And at that moment, a kind of a funny thing happened. Mr. Harrington looked at our chart and he said, you know, I have worked for this company for close to 30 years, and I have never seen our organization represented so clearly in relation to our competitors as I see in this map that you've created. He said, this is a magnificent chart, and he said, I think you should start to call this your $1 million chart. I'm hiring you to go ahead and develop that brand strategy just the way you describe it and make it work. And we, of course, were beside ourselves with excitement because we didn't know that we were going to be generating that kind of business from looking at their business in this clear way. But that's what happened. And in fact, by the time it was over, our consulting company had probably generated close to $5 million in consulting work with the Thomson Corporation over the next several years. And it was a great meeting and everyone was smiles. And then Mr. Harrington got up to leave. And as he was leaving, he kind of jokingly said, as he was pointing to our chart, he said, can I have a pen? We gave him a pen. He said, you know, there's one other way that we could move ourselves up into this quadrant. And everybody looked at him kind of expectantly. And laughingly, he just kind of said, well, we could buy them. That would do the same thing, wouldn't it? And everybody laughed because it was just this kind of off-the-cuff remark that no one had ever heard of before. Thomson buying Reuters? Are you out of your mind? Such a thing would never happen. It certainly would meet the strategic goal of becoming a globally recognized brand for the biggest company, and it would nearly double the size of the company, but no one had ever thought that Thomson might buy Reuters. Well, it turns out that perhaps someone had. And in reaction to this chart was the first time that anybody in that room had ever heard Mr. Harrington say, what would happen if Thomson bought Reuters? Guess what happened in the year 2008? About 5 years after we showed Mr. Harrington that chart, Thomson bought Reuters, and it ended up costing $17.2 billion. And by all measures, it has, of course, become now the largest professional publishing company in the world, almost by a factor of 2, and a very successful company, especially focused on financial information. So in summary, I want to share with you, as a lasting impression, the power of the 6x6 rule. The idea that if we can divide a problem up into 6 bite-sized pieces, and then we can add them up and find a way to visually map them together, often putting them all together, we will end up with our multivariable plot, which shows why we might be able to do something, how we might be able to do it, when we would need to do it, who would do it, and how much might it cost. And in this particular case, our multivariable plot wasn't the $1 million chart. We all laughed and said, well, it's really the $17.2 billion chart. That's the power of breaking a problem down into its 6 visual pieces.